Compact phones aren't too common these days, and they typically come with a major downside, a smaller battery and less battery life. That's not the case though with Sony's new mid-ranger, the Xperia 10 Mark IV. But besides the battery life, what else does this compact phone have to offer? I'm Will for GSM Arena, and let's find out in our full review. The Xperia 10 Mark IV brings a familiar Sony design, but even so, there are a few changes in terms of both looks and features compared to the previous model. This year's design might seem less premium, being plastic rather than glass, but it still brings IP-rated waterproofing. The matte finish and sharper edge provide a bit of extra grip compared to last year, and remarkably, even though the Mark IV has a bigger battery, it's even lighter and very easy to hold in one hand. Last year's Xperia 10 Mark III had a 4500 mAh battery and excellent battery life, but the Mark IV takes this a step further with its 5000 mAh power pack, and the result is class-leading. Mid-rangers these days typically score an endurance rating of around 120 hours in our battery life tests, but the Xperia 10 Mark IV blows them away with a score of 163 hours. But on the flip side, many competitors have really fast charging, and this year Sony doesn't even include a charger in the box. Using a standard 65-watt USB power delivery charger, we were able to charge from 0 to just 28% in half an hour. Another difference compared to last year's model is the chipset. On the Xperia 10 Mark IV, you get a Snapdragon 695 chipset, compared to the Mark III's Snapdragon 690. The difference isn't huge. You still get 5G connectivity, plus there's a more efficient 6nm manufacturing process, and the benchmark scores are a little bit better. There is one major downside though. The 695 doesn't support 4K video recording, which you did get last year. Overall, when it comes to performance, the Mark IV does an okay job, but it really is outclassed by a lot of the competitors. Still, the UI and your everyday tasks feel snappy enough. On the front, the display is nearly the same as last year, a 6-inch OLED with a 1080p resolution and a standard 60Hz refresh rate. One difference is that the display has Gorilla Glass Victus protection, while last year's model had Gorilla Glass 6. And on top of that, this panel is considerably brighter than the previous models. There's no more auto brightness boost, but with either that mode or the manual slider, we were able to achieve a maximum of around 680 nits. One thing we would like to have seen on the Mark IV though is a high refresh rate. At this point, 60Hz feels a bit sluggish and outdated, even in the mid-range segment. Still, the panel is sharp, and we appreciate the cinematic 21:9 aspect ratio. Plus, since the selfie cam is in the top bezel, you don't have to worry about a cutout eating into the frame. You get deep blacks and HDR support, and while colors aren't the most accurate out of the box, there are plenty of options to tweak them in settings. For audio, the Xperia 10 Mark IV has a headphone jack and a single loudspeaker. Rather than being bottom firing, the speaker actually faces the front. It's not the loudest, scoring below average in our volume test, and the sound quality isn't very impressive either. The phone comes with just one option for storage, 128 gigs. It is expandable though. And waking up and unlocking the phone can be done with a side-mounted fingerprint reader, which is very fast. The new Xperia phones run a very stock-feeling Android 12 interface, with a few proprietary Sony features here and there. Many functions are taken care of through Google's apps, like file management and the gallery. One of the Sony features is the multi-window switch. It's basically a double task switcher. It allows you to navigate and switch apps for split-screen mode. Another unique feature is SideSense. A handle on the side of the phone opens up a menu of shortcuts to apps and features, and you can add shortcuts to multi-window pairs as well. There are a few features missing on the Xperia 10 Mark IV compared to the flagship though, such as the game enhancer and the in-depth camera apps. Speaking of cameras, let's get into them. It's almost the same setup as last year, a 12-megapixel main camera, an 8-megapixel telephoto with 2x optical zoom, and an 8-megapixel ultra-wide camera. The differences you'll find here are thanks to the main cam now having OIS, and some updates in processing. During the day, quality from the main cam is decent for the class. There's a good level of detail and sharpening is balanced. Colors are saturated enough too. The dynamic range isn't the widest though, and you may end up with some lost detail in the extremes. The results from the portrait mode are okay in terms of separation, but you can end up with the occasional mistake around the hair. 2x zoom shots from the telephoto are nicely sharp and detailed. The photos are well exposed and have a very good dynamic range. Photos from the ultra-wide have a more saturated color rendition, which doesn't match the other two cameras, but it's still likable. There's a decent level of detail, and the dynamic range is good for this sort of camera. In low light, the main cam's performance is improved over last year's model. The dynamic range is wider, especially in the highlights, and you also get decent sharpness and well-saturated colors. Our main criticism is that in darker scenes, we experience focus hunting and missed focus from time to time. There is a night mode available on the Xperia 10 Mark IV, and it works to improve the detail level in the shadows, as well as rein in the highlights. These shots can be a little softer than the regular photos. Unlike the Mark III, the Xperia 10 Mark IV prefers to use the telephoto cam rather than a digital zoom at night. The results are okay, if a bit underexposed. In better lit situations, the detail level is actually pretty good. Night mode does a good job to lift the shadows, bringing out more detail there. The sharpening is a bit on the heavy side though. The ultra-wide cam's nighttime photos are soft and quite noisy. The results are still soft in night mode, but with less noise and wider dynamic range. Selfies are taken with the 8 megapixel front-facing cam, and they're okay. This year there's new AI processing on by default, called Sharpen Faces. With it on, the faces have a slightly overprocessed look, and you get a decent amount of detail, reasonably wide dynamic range, and somewhat muted colors. You can toggle off the AI processing, and the results are softer, and the faces are more smoothed out looking. Now on to video recording. As I mentioned earlier, it's capped at 1080p resolution. Quality from the main cam is so-so. The dynamic range is pretty good, and colors are likable, but there is visible pixelation and aliasing if you look closely. Footage from the telephoto cam is a bit better, at least there's no pixelation, and detail looks okay. Video from the ultra-wide cam is pretty solid for this sort of camera. We like the level of detail and the rendition, and there are good looking colors and wide dynamic range. So that's the Xperia 10 Mark IV. Like I mentioned at the beginning, you get a slim, compact form factor together with awesome battery life. Plus you get waterproofing and a telephoto cam, which are hard to come by on a mid-ranger. However, compared to last year, you miss out on 4K video recording, and there's no charger in the box. And we wish there were more upgrades here. The chipset isn't really any more competitive, the charging is still slow, and you still don't get a high refresh rate on the screen or stereo speakers. So in the end, if you're looking for those sorts of features, you'd have to search elsewhere. But the Xperia 10 Mark IV is still a solid phone, especially if you want a long-lasting battery. Thanks for watching guys, stay safe and see you on the next one.